Hey everybody, welcome to Dungeon Brew. Today we're going to be talking about traps, riddles, and puzzles. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Hey everyone, today we're talking about traps, riddles, and puzzles. This has been a video that we talked about making because I keep making references to the way that I handle these things, and I know Joshua has too. And what this video is basically the video that explains some of the way that we go about handling traps, riddles, and puzzles, because when we create these things, we're trying to involve as many people as possible, and we want to explain how you can do that in your own games.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my biggest frustrations, probably, whether it's being a player or as a DM, is that the people that come together to play Dungeons and Dragons or any tabletop role-playing game is that they see traps, riddles, and puzzles as a means to kind of exhibit skill checks of the characters within the game. Like, look how high my skill check is or whatever. And they just approach it as I'm going to roll a dice and overcome whatever this is and move on. Sometimes it's frustrating because I play a lot of thieves, which you know, John, that, you know, it's the way of making the thief be worthwhile or outside of combat in like non-combat scenarios. And this also oftentimes steals away from what other characters could do or what would naturally come to other players within the course of gameplay, because the thief is taking care of everything outside of the course of combat. You know, whether I'm looking for a trap or I'm searching or I'm sneaking and everyone else is just kind of trailing behind waiting for something exciting to happen. So we're going to dive into this and look at each one of these and how you can really make them, I think, an opportunity for the party to come together and work together and make good memories, and realize that Dungeons and Dragons isn't just about those long battles or those fight scenes.
Yeah, and I have to apologize to folks because we're going to be referring to the rogue as a thief and vice versa back and forth during this, because I'm prepping for our next campaign, which is old school, and it's a thief there, and that's what's in my brain. I think Joshua's picked up on that. So thief, rogue, same thing, same idea. But definitely, like, what we want is, we don't want a trap relegated down to, let me roll a d20, success we move forward, fail we move past, or we don't. That's not, it's just not as much engagement. Not only is it not engaging for the people around the rogue or thief who's making that roll, but for them it really is just a die roll and then you move forward, which is not really much fun. There's not much problem solving involved in that. There's no engagement between the members of the party or between the players. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are allowing that to occur. So we're going to talk about a few different types of traps and some of the ways that you can develop those a little bit more fully to involve more members of the party. And then we're going to move on to riddles and puzzles here in a little bit.
Yeah, so I was just thinking off the top of my head as you mentioned problem solving, because I think it's such a huge piece for what D&D is. We always kind of joke about all the things that I learned about in playing D&D. And when I'm thinking about the traps, riddles, and puzzles piece, there's a lot of problem solving that comes out of that, and a good DM is going to make it a problem solving opportunity. So one of the first traps, which you probably see listed in your Dungeon Master Guide, is going to be collapsing roofs. How do you handle that, John?
So the collapsing roof is kind of an old standby, and that's what a lot of the ones in the DMG are, the simple traps that you see all the time. But the collapsing roof is, the way that it's described is basically this tripwire, and the tripwire, you disable it and then you can move forward. What I like to do is I like to try and involve other members of the party when you're talking about something like that. So maybe the tripwire does need cut, but before you cut the tripwire, you need to change whatever the tripwire is affecting, which is presumably the roof going to be collapsing. Well, the roof collapsing has to have a weak point of some kind, and so what you can do is you can allow the collapsing roof maybe to be somewhat obvious. Maybe they have to search for the tripwire. Finding the tripwire should be a group effort. It may not necessarily be the thief. Once you found that, then the thief goes, well, hey, in order to actually disable this, I need to make sure that the roof is not going to actually collapse when I'm done with it. So we're going to take this spear that we're carrying with us or something like that, and there's a hole in the roof, and we need somebody with a really high strength to cram that pole or that spear or something into that hole in the collapsing roof, so that when I cut the tripwire, it's going to hold. And that is something that just pulls in more members of the party. It's not simple. It does require problem solving. More than one person is engaged, and even though it may only be one or two people actually making rolls at the end, it still requires that the group as a whole talk about what's going on with that trap to engage it before they move forward.
Yeah, another great example is the falling net, which I'll be honest, I haven't come across this a lot in games that I've played. It's very rarely I have a DM just drop a net on my head.
Yeah.
But it's always been kind of silly to think that there's a net hanging up in the trees and somebody's not going to notice that, and you have to have a thief notice that net that's hanging up there to drop on top of you. Having just generalized perception checks from the parties they're moving through, or using their passive perception to notice that net, can be one way to involve everyone in there. And then you may not just need the thief to disable that. Maybe the thief fails in their disable check with their thieves tools and aren't able to do anything with it. So you could have your wizard or your druid maybe burn it up with a flaming sphere, or find another way to handle that trap specifically. And just a quick thought on that as we're talking about this too. I think that sometimes we come into a place as dungeon masters where we create some sort of obstacle like that, and the thief doesn't make the check to disable it, and then the party's stuck.
Yeah.
And they don't know how to go forward because the thief, well, he failed it. Well, you can't just keep rolling it over and over and over again. And then we don't allow other party members to problem solve with their own skills or their own spells or abilities to be able to overcome whatever that barrier is.
Well, the falling net should be indicative of something, because like you said, what does the falling net really do? It falls on you and you go, well, this sucks, and then you take it off. Really what it should be is it should be indicative of an ambush of some kind. So maybe they notice that net and they're not necessarily interested in disabling it. They need to find out what is lurking around the corner that's waiting for them to trip it. So there's other things to think about when you're thinking about traps, and that usually has to do with the purpose. Why is it there, and what does it have to do with what else is going on? And that also engages the party. So the next one in the list here is the fire-breathing statue, which it could be a fire-breathing anything, doesn't really matter. The idea is that there's fire coming across. So kind of like the net, there should be general perception checks. Anybody should be able to notice that there's scorched stone or marks on the walls or something like that that indicates that there's fire present. The next thing is that how do you find the actual triggering mechanism, which in this case I think is a pressure plate or something like that. What they offer as a suggestion is that you wedge something underneath it in order to disable that pressure plate. I think that that's an okay solution. I think it would be better if you did something along the lines of saying, well, the pressure plate needs to be pried up by somebody. Again, this is probably a strength-oriented thing, but it needs to be pried up so that the thief can go in there and disable it if you want to actually disable the trap. But that's only one option for how to disable this trap. It's also possible that you've got some kind of hole where the fire is coming out of. Maybe you can clog that up, put something in there to prevent the fire from coming out. And there's a variety of options. They should have stuff in their bags they bring with them to solve those kinds of problems. If you encourage that behavior, you'll see that behavior from your players. And then if your thief is doing a thorough investigation of the fire-breathing statue, he may determine that it doesn't have anything to do with oil, it doesn't have anything to do with any flammable liquids, it's a magical trap. And if it's a magical trap, then you can always bring a wizard in to cast Dispel Magic or something else. What that means, though, is it just means that you're involving more members of the party in order to try and solve that trap. And the best way of doing this is presenting the mechanics of the trap, the way that it's constructed, giving them evidence, and then allowing them to take that information and come to their own conclusions.
Yeah, and you and I talked about this a little bit. Back in older editions especially, there was a lot of different tools you could buy through the manual, whether it's ball bearings or flour or something to be able to utilize to determine those types of things in dungeon and make it part of a problem-solving process with the entire party to figure it out. So whether we're talking about poison darts or spike traps or pits or whatever it is really set that expectation for your party about what they can bring along, what they can buy, what they would utilize those things from, and it may take some education from you as a DM about why those things exist within the item list, why they are available within your local tavern or shop, and how they might utilize that in the future, so that they know how those things were originally designed when you're playing a very engaging role-playing game like this.
Yeah, the pouch of flour is a classic one. You can use that to find secret openings. You can use it to find invisible people when you sprinkle it on the floor and see their footsteps. There's a variety of ways to use those things. And while I think that they still have like ball bearings, there's also traditional gear that you get like a shield. When you're talking about a poison dart trap, you see the hole in the wall. Allow your fighter to put the shield in front of him, gain full cover, and purposely trigger that trap as he walks towards it and just get a shield full of darts that don't penetrate the shield. There's no reason why they can't come up with inventive solutions for that type of thing. The way that you approach describing the trap, though, is definitely important in the way that your players also approach it. Because if you're just requesting that disable device type check and that's all that you're wanting from them, or a thieves tool check, I guess it's 5th edition, if you're just requesting that check, that's all they're going to give you. If you're describing the makeup of the trap, then it's left to them to determine how to solve that.
Yeah, have some fun with it. So let's dive over into riddles a little bit. I know that I love riddles. I use a lot of riddles. Sometimes I borrow riddles from famous games or other things that I've utilized. Sometimes I create my own. But I do like putting riddles into my game just because I like those mind things initially anyway. A couple of things to think about when you're doing riddles. One, remember that not everyone is going to get inside of your head and know what exactly it is that you're thinking and how you're wanting to put things together. Oftentimes, riddles require individuals to pull on outside knowledge and bring it into a game to try to figure that out. And that can be really frustrating for a party, especially if they're just stumped and they can't understand what it is that you're trying to get out of them. Mm-hmm. And then another piece with that, and I had it right on the tip of my tongue with a riddle, is... I can't remember it. Damn it. So I'll just give you my solution for how you handle this. One of the things that it'll come back to me later. But one of the things that I really liked in Baldur's Gate 2 actually did this, where there's a whole room full of statues that have riddles attached to each one of them, and there's a chest that's full of items. And it's like a multiple choice where you have to apply the item to the correct statue to solve what that riddle is. And this is a really fun way for your party to tackle riddles, is that they kind of have options in front of them to be able to apply, and they don't have to pull on outside knowledge. Right. It's kind of, again, it's just that multiple choice. They're like, hey, well, here's the items we have. Let's see if we can find the answer within these.
Yeah, and it's also a process of elimination. So if you have a really hard riddle in there that they don't get, if they can solve the other ones, then they slowly zone in on, we started with 10 items and we've solved 7 of the statue riddles, got rid of 7 of the items. There's only 3 left. One of them's the really hard one. And if we can figure out those other 2, we have the answer to the last one. So it creates a situation where it's difficult, but not as difficult as here's a riddle from the middle of nowhere. What am I thinking about? Which you talked about, which for some groups is really fun. It's for others it's not. And you really just need to know your group and know your players to figure out what's appropriate for you.
Oh, that was the other part I wanted to talk about. It's just knowing who your it's knowing who your party is or who your players are, and whether or not they're going to enjoy that type of thing. Some individuals really don't like riddles. They don't like the hang up that brings into the game, and you have to know that about the people you're playing with.
Right. So the last thing we have to talk about are puzzles. And puzzles, I think I tend to do more of these maybe than you do. But I don't do them all the time. I kind of sprinkle them throughout. It's not the same as a trap, where it's like if you go through a dungeon, you expect to see multiple traps through a dungeon. When it comes to a puzzle, I might have one puzzle in the dungeon. I may not put a puzzle in the dungeon every single time, because generally speaking, when I do puzzles, there's something that can take game time. Like, it can take a little while because there's a lot of problem solving involved in it, and there's multiple facets to it. Almost in the same way as what you're talking about with the riddle statues, I would expect if you have 10 riddles and 10 statues, that is not going to be something they solve in 5 minutes. It could take them 15, 30, 45 minutes to get through all of those riddles if they're particularly difficult. Puzzles are the same way. A couple of the ones that I have gone through recently, I usually, like rules of thumb, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're setting up what you want the puzzle to be, and that that to be clear to the players. You need to provide them with reference material. There needs to be something in game that they can utilize and call on in order to apply toward the puzzle that they're trying to solve. So it's not the same as a riddle where you're just giving them some information or giving them the puzzle and expecting them to figure it out. A puzzle really should be something that is communicative through the medium of the gameplay itself. And you need to be able to break that apart into chunks as best as possible so that it's not all at once. So one of the puzzles that I really enjoyed that you guys did is when we did the Temple of Halav in the Beckme campaign, there were a couple of things. The first thing that you found was the Song of Halav, which kind of went through and gave this long narrative history and verse of what happened to Halav. And then when you get to the temple, you're then trying to apply that song towards basically riddles that come up, and but you have that reference point. You can come back to the song, you can read through it, and you can see the stuff that's going on in the song and try and apply it towards that. One of the other things that you happen to get in that same dungeon was that you also got a map partially filled of the dungeon with some of the solutions already filled in, or references to the solutions, or clues as to how you find them. And so you were able to pull on multiple references in order to apply them towards the puzzle of getting from the beginning of the dungeon to the end of the dungeon, because it wasn't straightforward and it wasn't easy. But having those reference materials gave the opportunity for you to reference the song, reference the map, reference the clue as you came across it while you were in the dungeon, and then the players had time to communicate back and forth as they approached each one of those to try and solve it and move forward to the next task on their list.
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to recognize or remember that as individuals in the real world, we have certain knowledges that we possess, and we aren't skilled in everything. We're not all cryptologists. we can't all actually engage in these things in real life. And that's really the challenge with both riddles and puzzles, is making sure that you have the resources for your characters to go back to. And I think one of the best ways to accomplish this in game is that when you have your paladin roll a religion check, or your wizard roll a knowledge check of some kind, that check isn't necessarily just giving them the answer. It's not just like popping in and saying, oh, you know the answer's X. It's saying, you remember that you have this tomb or this document or this letter within your inventory that will give you some clues on how to solve this.
Right.
And it then directs them back to what references or resources you gave them to help work through that. But you can do additional checks if they're really still having a hard time to pinpoint where that's it within the document. But it's not you just as the DM having them roll a check and then giving them the answer.
Yeah, and I really like that option. It's something that you can do in a broader sense as well, because if you have and clerics and wizards and those types of classes make the most sense, because in general those are classes that have received some kind of formal education. So it could be something where you have the cleric who is making a religion check, and maybe they don't succeed, or maybe they barely succeed, so it's like they remember the name of the deity, but they don't remember much else. What they do remember is they remembered that a specific member of their clergy was an expert on this, and so they could use that person as a reference. The wizard may not remember specifically the information about the spell, but he does remember that it was crafted by Odaluk, and so he is going to go do some research on Odaluk so he can find more information about that spell. So you can create those reference points in game through the actual skill checks that they take, and it creates that investigation line for your questing. It creates the opportunity for other people to go out and look for information to bring that point back as a reference point to move the quest forward as well. So yeah, I really like that option, because it allows for world building, it allows for character building, it allows for questing to occur that isn't just let me roll a religion check and see if I know the answer.
And I think that's what we both share, is that when we look at traps, puzzles, riddles within the game, it's not just a quick obstacle for 5 minutes to jump over all the time. It can be that from time to time, but it's really an important aspect or element to gameplay in Dungeons & Dragons or any TTRPG. Like, it is part of the game, and it's okay to spend time in that part of the game and not just trying to skip by it or hurdle over it to get to that next battle.
I will say one more thing, and then I think we're probably at a wrap-up point here. I think that probably the only instance that I really think of when I want to use the simple trap with the simple DC check is in combat. So what that looks like is the party comes into a room. There are traps abound that snares and things like that, and those traps become obstacles. They become a tactical element in the combat as a whole, and then you might have the rogue or the thief going through and trying to disable them quickly, which results in a simple DC check to allow things to progress forward. That's really the only instance I can think of that kind of scenario occurring. Most of the rest of the time, I want those traps to be something that engages as many members of the party as it possibly can. All right, guys. Well, we will end it here. This has been the Traps, Riddles, and Puzzles video. We're going to continue to put out more content as we kind of come through and make some more decisions about what we think is going to be useful for you guys. If you have things that you want us to talk about, please feel free to leave a comment below so that we can add them to our list for upcoming videos.
Judge and Brew.